Everyone, good morning and welcome to the CSJ's brand spanking new offices. This is the first event we've run here and it's very exciting to host everyone, and I can say that we can all breathe a collective sigh of relief because our operations director's off this morning, which means you can put your coffee cup anywhere you want without getting a rollicking for leaving marks, etc. I am full of hope that this place will be a key venue for many years to come in holding governments to account in how they battle injustice and how they support the potential that is out there in our poorest communities. And in that sense, I can think of no better person for us to have our first platform to in this new space than our great friend, the amazing Baroness Newlove. Today marks the final big report published by Baroness Newlove in her time as Victims Commissioner, and it tackles a subject she sadly knows all too well, the injustice of antisocial behaviour. As someone who has lived through a tragic circumstance and somehow used it to try and make the world a better place, it's our honour to host you here today, and we want to learn from your reflections. Ably aiding Helen is a panel of fantastic experts. Jenny Herrera, CEO of ASB Help, Dr. Becky Thompson, Senior Lecturer at Nottingham Trent University, and our very own Head of Criminal Justice, Rory Gagan. We will hear from Helen, then we'll hear from each of them, then we'll open up for some questions and some discussion. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome you to the stage in your high heels.
Yeah, oh, this is not very silly. Not for me anyway. Can I just move back? Good morning, everybody. I feel like I've done a full shift as it is this morning, so that's why I was gnawing on my biscuit. This is a really important report for me because it's so personal, but actually listening to everybody around the country, it's more paramount that we actually understand what antisocial behaviour is like. As it's been said, almost 12 years since I lost my husband Gary, who was kicked to death by a gang of youths, and suffered 14 internal injuries and 14 kicks to the head. All because he asked who was vandalising my car. Never did I think he wouldn't walk through our home again. And that's why I think I get really passionate. Even this morning people have said you sound very disillusioned about what's going on, but it's a passion really, because to see people going through this is so sad 12 years on. In fact, we're talking about gang crime and knife crime, and that's what happened where I live, because over a period of time there was gangs who had been targeting the street, great people who lived there, an ordinary street, ordinary working families, and what I really liked was a close-knit community. Until that point it was very peaceful and happy place to live. The children could play freely and parents would get together and socialise. To this day I have no idea why the gang targeted us. After all, none of them lived in the street. All I do know is Gary was the third attack on the night. But they did attack him, and so often is the case with antisocial behaviour. It is entirely random acts. So it started with what I call yobbish behaviour, drunken behaviour and threatening behaviour, escalated into graffiti and damaging property, and eventually needless violence. As you would expect, we contacted the police and the officials. We called community meetings to demand action. We did all the right things that anybody in this room would do, because if you were in our position, I'm sure you'd want action instead of words. My abiding memory, however, of this sense of frustration because nobody was listening, nothing was happening. So it truly saddens me that my last conversation with my neighbour from a community meeting was that nothing will happen until somebody is murdered. And sadly they don't know that that was going to be Gary. So for me, I understand the misery and the distress that these actions can cause. And that is why I feel so enraged whenever police and politicians, who I do work with, dismiss it as low-level crime. Low level, the actual violence, the impact on individuals, communities, for me, that is a disgraceful terminology. So I ask all of you here today, if we take just one thing away from this meeting here, it is that we will never, ever use those words when describing antisocial behaviour. And I will also challenge any of our colleagues, which I do on a daily basis when I go anywhere, because they should do the same. Because when I lost Gary, there was a national outcry that the failure to deal with antisocial behaviour in our streets could have led to a senseless murder. His death touched a nerve. People could see that it could so easily have been on their doorstep. I heard from thousands of people that I don't know and didn't know me. And yet, despite all the promises made at the time, I find that even today, 12 years later, the circumstances leading up to Gary's death are still being echoed around our country. Fiona Pilkington, David Askew, they were human lives. We haven't changed. And yet here again, I'm still calling for more to be done about the antisocial behaviour. So it is truthful to say depressingly little has changed. And in fact, the figures show it's getting worse, with the highest ever recorded figure of people experiencing or witnessing antisocial behaviour. And to those who say that the police have more important work, which I've had all this morning, to do them deal with antisocial behaviour, let us not forget that ASB, I'm going to keep saying that because otherwise I'll bore you to death in antisocial behaviour, can often be symptomatic of a more serious behaviour involving crime. For example, drug gangs taking over or cuckooing a property to sell drugs generates a great deal of antisocial behaviour, and is also a symptom of the serious violence and drug offences. This report is a combined strength, working with such great friends in this room, for which I'm really honoured and humbled, especially as this is my last review as Victims Commissioner. So I would like to thank Centre for Social Justice, ASB Help and Nottingham Trent University. Between all of us, what we have is a detailed account of victims of ASB across the country, being let down by the criminal justice agencies, officials and housing providers. Over the years, I have been Victims Commissioner. I've met many victims going through ASB. Sadly, too often I hear stories of police and housing officials treating each incident in an isolation, whilst allowing the underlying causes to go ignored. So there appears to be a prevailing culture across all our agencies of viewing ASB as not a priority. And I sense that as a consequence of this culture, police officers, officials, are simply failing to grasp the impact it has had on victims. By this, I not only mean the impact on their mental health, but their ability to function. For example, holding down employment or to socialise with friends, or indeed maintain relationships. And of course, these victims have no right to seek the practical and emotional help of our local victim support services. In some areas, these services will offer support, in others they will be turned away. Often agencies fail to talk to one another or share information. And one of the disappointing features of the case studies was hearing stories of victims being passed from one agency to another. I know only too well it can feel as if you're one being the nuisance. It's quite easy to say, oh, calm down dear, I'll go away. And having the temerity to complain in the first place, it leaves you feeling as if no one is listening. Even trying to report ASB on the police 101 phone line can be a struggle, with long waits and sometimes getting no answer at all. So it's little wonder so many victims give up on that and feel compelled to calling 999. My report therefore asks that the operation of the 101 phone line be looked into. It will be put in a more bluntly, as I say, it's not fit for purpose. You cannot resource it properly, scrap it. 5 years ago, the government introduced the ASB case review, more commonly called a community trigger, and at the time I thought it was a horrible title. It aims to enable victims to hold their local agencies accountable in resolving the antisocial behaviour. If they meet a threshold, usually 3, which I disagreed at the time, reports of separate incidents within a 6-month period, victims can request a multi-agency case review. We love long titles in Westminster. The purpose of such review is to discuss the case and to seek to resolve such behaviour. So in theory, this might sound very sensible, but I can tell you, sadly, in reality, it is nothing like that. In many parts of the country, you will be very hard-pressed to find evidence of this new power in use. with many police forces and councils and officials making no reference to it on their websites. It is left to the victim to surf the internet, often in desperation to see what help might be available to them. Half of officials surveyed have no record of using the mechanism in the past 12 months. Does this mean that all their residents are living in such sweet harmony and therefore they have no need for it? If so, I want to go and live there, because I very much doubt it. Indeed, some victims have found this community trigger on the internet, requested it, only to find that police and officials have never even heard it. As one official said, "I think this has just fizzled out." Even those victims who were able to use the trigger often still felt frustrated and, more importantly, excluded. It's hard to believe that these meetings designed to find a resolution are being held behind closed doors, with victims not allowed to attend and give their account of what is happening and how it is affecting their lives. We are told time and time again that victims are at the heart of the criminal justice system. And so I ask myself, how is this aspiration consistent with telling victims of ASB they cannot attend a community trigger resolution meeting? So what you have is a closed meeting of the agencies who have so far failed to deal with the antisocial behaviour, to review their actions, or dithering as I put it, and to date and decide whether more can be done. Not only is the victim not there, but there is no external challenge to those agencies. So to me it feels like the police and officials are marking their own homework. So how does this provide victims with the confidence that things will change? Because things must change. To begin with, police and council staff must be trained to recognise the impact of a persistent ASB. So this means getting them to look at the pattern of the harassment and not treating incidents in isolation. It also means victims have access to the same practical and emotional support given to all other victims of other crimes. There needs to be a legal requirement for all officials, police and crime commissioners to display accurate guidelines on their community trigger. There needs to appear prominently on their websites. I do recognise not everyone has access to an internet. My mother's 87. Information, so therefore, must be available on notice boards, leaflets, newsletters, so everybody has that place to seek help. The Home Office, and here we go again, I called it DCLG, it's MHCLG, which is Department for Local Government and Housing, I'll say, is set down data requirements for our police and officials on a community trigger activity, which again must be published. Victims not only want to be supported, we've got to start empowering them. The starting point is a requirement for all police and officials to proactively inform victims about their entitlements under the community trigger. The current practice appears to be hoping no one will actually notice. That is simply not good enough. They must have an automatic right, victims, to attend a trigger resolution meeting. It must be alright for them to explain the impact on their behaviour of what it's like living within a community of antisocial behaviour. How else would you really feel and understand what they're going through? Because this meeting then needs to offer challenge, an effective challenge. The starting point is a requirement that meetings must be chaired by an independent external person, someone who is fully trained and equipped to challenge and direct additional evidence, so that is all made available. These measures will not cause antisocial behaviour to be a thing of the past, sadly not, but they will ensure that victims are supported, empowered, and that they have a voice. This is my final report as Victims Commissioner, and for personally it's so sad to find that so many families are continuing to suffer from antisocial behaviour. It is particularly sad that their experiences so often mirror those of my own family 12 years ago. Antisocial behaviour is important for where you live, for what you own your own home, and for every individual in the community and across the country. Because people telling you how it is where they don't live, how the impact is and it actually isn't, is surely and truly better for people to get decent and treat people with humanity, because aggression and rage can lead to somebody else losing their life. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Helen. Amazing reflections. We're going to hear from each of the panel. In this way, we'll start with Becky, if we can, and before we open to questions.
Myself and colleagues from Nottingham Trent University and the University College London have recently completed a piece of research which looked to answer the question, who experiences antisocial behaviour and in what context? So we're really pleased that findings from that research have made their way into this report. And for us, this report is hugely important in terms of its focus on victims of antisocial behaviour and the practical recommendations that it makes in terms of improving our response to those incidents and reducing the harm caused. So in terms of our research, we analysed a number of existing data sources which we think gives a national picture and some national context within the report. And our main source of data was something called the Crime Survey for England and Wales. So this is a really useful source of data because it captures incidents reported to the police or local authority, as well as the incidents which aren't reported. And so this, for me, gives a much more accurate picture of the true extent and the true nature of antisocial behaviour, not just the stuff that comes to the attention of the relevant authorities. So we analysed the data under four main themes. So experience, perception, reporting and impact, and you'll see that within the report. And the survey is constructed in such a way that it allowed us to look at antisocial behaviour as a whole, as well as looking at those different types of ASB separately, so things like nuisance neighbours, fly tipping, street drinking and so on. So this meant we could determine reporting patterns and the impact across different types of ASB. And our main finding is that there were subtle differences in terms of who experiences those 13 different types, in terms of the impact of those different types, and in terms of the reporting. So for me, this suggests a need for an antisocial behaviour specific approach and a multi-agency approach, so getting all of those partners around the table. In practical terms, we would really like to see our research used in terms of informing risk assessment practices, particularly at the point of report. So we've identified there are certain characteristics about individuals, about their households and about where they live that make them more vulnerable. Make them more vulnerable to experiencing ASB in the first place, to experiencing repeated incidents of ASB and to reporting high levels of harm. So we want to use that to help the most vulnerable and use that information to inform both prevention activity and improving our response and having a better, more effective response to those victims. So we feel this report collectively brings together a really, really powerful body of evidence around the need to take antisocial behaviour seriously, not downplay its impact, and put the needs of victims first. I wanted to finish just by thanking the Economic and Social Research Council, who funded our research, and the Victims Commissioner, ASB Help, and the Centre for Social Justice for highlighting this really important issue.
I think, Jenny, we're going to hear from you now. No, one in, one out.
Good morning. I run a charity that seeks to help and advise victims of antisocial behaviour. On a daily basis, we hear from victims of antisocial behaviour that are at their wits' end. They do not know where else to turn. They've found us, usually trawling on the internet, and they come to us and say, what else can we do? ASB Help started in 2013. So when we came into being, it was very much against the backdrop of the new legislation is coming in. There's going to be legal tools and powers so that agencies can act much more quickly to give respite to victims. It was sort of quite a positive moment, and as a charity that focuses on victims, we went straight into the community trigger. And we have done an extensive work on the community trigger, or also called the ASB case review, to look at how it's really working on the ground. And sadly, as Baroness Newlove has already said, that it is fraught with problems at every single level. To start with, we had to find it. Now, how victims were ever going to know about it, we trawled through every single local authority area to find out who was the lead agency, because in some areas it's the police, other areas it's the council, and where they've hidden the information. We've had situations where they said community trigger for antisocial behaviour, but actually they're talking about a stop and search facility. It has been hidden at the bottom about antisocial behaviour, or we can't find it at all. We contact them and they say, oh, well, we know to recommend it if someone calls us. This was supposed to be put in place to empower victims, not hidden away, not something to be scared of as some kind of other complaints process. This is to recognise that it's a problem-solving, multi-agency way to deal with many incidents of antisocial behaviour. And you see, the advantage of getting everyone round the table is that together they realise the cumulative effect. The council realised, oh, we've been dealing with this case for a while. And then the police came on board, and when everyone gets round the table, let's creatively think. This isn't something to be scared of. This is something that I believe, and our charity believes, has the potential to make a real difference, but it's not fit for purpose. So if the lead agency is the council, they're the only one in that area that has any information about it. So I was speaking on radio programmes this morning and saying, telling them what it was, but then I can't say, and this is the number to call if you think you should be activating a community trigger, because you've got to actually hunt down your local one. So we put in a community trigger directory so that people can find it. But I would suggest that if the council is the lead agency, the PCC, the police, big housing associations in the area should be, directing victims in so that they can find out about it and make it accessible. The statutory guidance for the Antisocial Behaviour Crime and Policing Act was updated in 2017, and I spent most of 2017 campaigning that we use this to launch the community trigger again. Use it to really let victims know. It was launched on Christmas Eve, a Sunday. I ask you, is that putting victims first? Could they have found a quieter time to launch that? So that statutory guidance recommends making it accessible. So give victims different ways: phone number, email, online form. 36% of areas still give only one way of doing that. For some it is that dreaded 101 number, where they're trying to get through for 40 minutes, and when the call handler takes their call, they don't know what they're talking about. For others, it's some unwieldy PDF form. We are making something so inaccessible to victims who have been suffering, in most cases, for months, perhaps years. And they shouldn't have to go through all these hoops. They should just be able to cry out for help and say, what can be done? Because something can be done. The threshold is confusing. There are many areas around the country that use a 3 for an individual or 5 households. That was used in the pilots before the legislation was passed and is not in the legislation. Other areas add that a case needs to be closed before you can activate the trigger. That is just not true. Is there any surprise that victims are at their wits' end? They're wondering where to turn, and then, as you've heard, that even when it does get into case review, often there's no one independent there, let alone chairing it. The victim isn't allowed to come and represent themselves. Victims do understand that police have got other, things that demand their attention. They're not saying, look at me now, but they're saying, don't just completely ignore me. They're saying, we know you can't tell me all the data protection details about the offender, but at least let me in the room and explain the impact it's having. We did some qualitative research on victims who had gone through the case review. They were harrowing interviews that we had, because in all situations the problem hadn't got better, and in some cases it had even got worse. And finally, as we heard, each local authority area is obliged to report on the statistics, which would be really useful to see how it's being used across the country. We've had to try and pull that out. It's like pulling teeth. Many areas have used it as a freedom of information request, when actually it's legally supposed to be published. There is no central government leadership over making the community trigger fit for purpose, or in fact anything with victims of antisocial behaviour. So when I do see some massive error in a website about how they are explaining the community trigger, I can mention it to the Home Office, but nothing is getting done, and therefore nothing is going to change. We are really say that we need someone who's going to take that responsibility, and that's not requiring a huge resource. It's just having someone there who will ensure that everyone knows about this, who is entitled to use it, and that it's actually working. We are so grateful to the Centre for Social Justice, to the Victims Commission, and it's been great to work with Trent University as well, because we have been going on and on about this for years, and we are delighted that today there's a chance to just really push it into the forefront, and we just want to see change. Thank you.
Rory.
It's a tough act to follow, those three women talking there passionately about the issue. I just wanted to say as well, it was great to be able to bring you guys together for the round table, and some of you in the room as well who were around those tables when we had the discussions. And certainly we look forward to sort of carrying this forward because it is such an important issue. Certainly from my time, so for those who don't know, back in the day I was a local police officer down in South London, so I've seen firsthand how antisocial behaviour can really put huge pressure on families, relationships, and leave victims feeling unsafe in their own homes. You know, it's not, you know, perhaps like crime sometimes where it's a one-off thing in a street that you go, well, why me? But at least it was in the street. This stuff can really ruin people's homes, home environments. And, you know, and I remember, you know, a case of a hard-working family with young children on one estate who'd forgotten the last time they'd actually managed to get a night's sleep. You know, the screaming, the shouting, the banging, the goings-on next door, comings and goings, drug addicts, drug dealers, all of that. Well, when they try to speak to the perpetrators, as you try to say, do you mind just being a bit quiet? Torrent of vile abuse. They fell between the cracks, like so many that we've heard. You know, falling between the cracks of a 101 service that says, well, noise nuisance, that's a local authority matter. Call the local authority, well, who's your landlord? Or, you know, what time are you affecting by the noise? Because our team only operate this sort of time or that sort of time. And they were, we've heard this term and it's true, they were at their wits' end. Unfortunately, you know, by being a good neighbourhood police officer, which I think we need some more of, you know, I was able to really help them. And, you know, unfortunately, as in so many cases, their home environment had been so sort of poisoned by the experience that they felt the need to move. Other cases I could talk to, you know, a couple who bought their first home, a flat down in South London again, you know, 50 calls later to various agencies to try and get the trap house that had been cocooned above them dealt with. You know, each morning they'd come out and they'd find human feces and all sorts of stuff in their front door, struggling to get night's sleep. They actually sold up and moved even after the problem had been solved because the place was just, they had such bad memories. They lost their deposit they worked so hard for. So this stuff really does affect, you know, sort of everyone really. And that's just two of the cases that I could speak to, and of course the panel could speak to even more. Similarly, I think without proactive policing, there isn't that opportunity often for people to come forward. You know, 101 is one avenue, and we've heard the challenges there. Online, another avenue. There's challenges there still. But also for those people who perhaps don't, you know, think of bothering the police with this, and we hear it all too often, you know, low-level stuff. Actually, often the only time that it is heard is when it's a police officer or a community outreach person or someone else in the community. We're never going to have enough police, obviously. You know, people always want more. But I think it's right that the Home Secretary has sort of put a bit of a flag in the sand on seeking a better settlement. And I think quite rightly too, there's a question about, well, with that resource, how do we make the most of it? And so I think there's a lot of good stuff in the report today, particularly the review of 101, and a question of, you know, if you're not going to resource it properly, then is it worth having it? And I think it's all the more important too, with antisocial behaviour, including the prevention and response to it, that we get it back on the agenda. Because, as we've heard, things are getting worse, not better. Last year, 36% of people in England and Wales personally experienced or witnessed antisocial behaviour in their community, the highest percentage, as we've heard, on record. Of these, over half were persistent victims who suffered at least one incident every month. The misery and the torment suffered, as we've heard, and hopefully many of us don't have to experience, is unrelenting. Time and again it's downplayed, again as we've heard, low level. Authorities fail, I think, to understand, and it's a theme across other crime categories too, as well as antisocial behaviour. They view things in isolation, they don't view the bigger the public interest, the bigger the public cost, that longer term cost and harm. And I think too, as police and other agencies have struggled to meet the challenges obviously of austerity, and this isn't letting them off the hook, they've sought to manage demand through a combination of new assessments and triages, and in many cases, again, another word we hear often in relation to antisocial behaviour, thresholds. You know, part of the problem is we don't actually have the research to tell us enough about those threshold effects. So at what point, how many calls do we have to have before we can say, actually, we need to intervene now. We don't even have that sort of starting point. And of course, the other problem too, even in the absence of that more compelling sort of quantitative evidence, is that if we don't tackle antisocial behaviour swiftly and effectively, if we don't take it seriously, if we don't send a clear message that it's unacceptable, then what sort of society does that create? And is that a society we want to live in and that we want to bring our children up in? We published a devastating report yesterday on the conditions in our prisons, an environment which itself has, I think, been sort of depoliced, if you will, over several years, and seen horrendous increases in incivility towards staff and each other within that environment, antisocial behaviour, and of course, again, which I think is so important, we understand the link then, and the escalation into then violence. We shouldn't tolerate that direction of travel in our prisons, and we certainly shouldn't tolerate it outside either. And that's why I think we need to see that focus now from politicians and policymakers who are focused on violence reduction. They must not exclude this issue of antisocial behaviour. They must recognise that this sits at the heart of things, just as victims should sit at the heart of our criminal justice system. When Bill Bratton turned around New York City's terrible record on violence and crime, it was at least as much about tackling the antisocial as it was about tackling the violence and crime. If you travel on a train without a ticket, if you drink alcohol where you shouldn't, no references to any sort of shadow homosexuality, if you drive without insurance, if you play loud music and make noise throughout the night with no regard for your neighbours, what other norms, what other laws, what other harms are you causing? Tackling antisocial behaviour must therefore sit at the heart of any government's vision to tackle crime and create safer and prosperous communities. We must recognise too that antisocial behaviour can be a debilitating force, fostering anxiety, insecurity, and as we've said, leaving victims feeling helpless and unsafe, often within their own homes. We know from the analysis from the crime survey, 4 in 5 people believe it's got worse. We also know from the voter tracking data from YouGov, the issue of crime after leaving the European Union is the #1 issue. So I think it would be a very foolhardy government that overlooked the need to have a compelling vision and to really build a narrative around antisocial behaviour. As part of our research, we've been out and about visiting Charity Alliance members, and the overwhelming impression we've got from community cafes and elsewhere is that victims are feeling let down. They're sympathetic to the pressures on the system, but they do feel let down. They echo much of what has been heard today and is in the report. We heard from one elderly woman, Marjorie. She'd lived on the same street all her life and now desperately wanted to move because of antisocial behaviour. Her neighbours had basically been put in there, irresponsible landlords, and they'd slowly taken over half the houses on the street, and Marjorie, once proud of her street, no longer wanted anything to do with it. Neighbours having loud parties at all hours, letting gardens overflow with rubbish, rats, young people literally harassing a 92-year-old woman just living a few doors down. The victim in this case had tried phoning everyone, her council, the police. She tried to contact the property's landlord, but she didn't have any luck. She's been passed from one supposed authority to the next. She felt fobbed off. Nobody was prepared to offer her the support and help she needed. Apparently, it wasn't serious enough. It wasn't worth it, but do keep calling. And of course, we know that victims do give up. And so, we do need to actually have a solution to this. And so part of the solution lies in resourcing these services at a level commensurate to the demand and harms, but it's also about much more than resource. It must also come, and I think we've heard this today, must come through an overarching and compelling narrative and real clear leadership that explains why this stuff matters, how it fits together, how it's joined up, and how dealing with it properly saves people heartache, saves people misery, saves people time, and for those with a fiscal sort of purse strings in mind, saves money too. Giving our police the powers to intervene and disrupt antisocial behaviour before it spirals into something worse is something we ourselves are also looking at. For example, in Scotland, police there have the ability to tackle noise nuisance much more swiftly. Victims themselves need to feel valued and supported when reporting their experiences, and in our field work too, we heard how victims sometimes felt guilty for even having dared to file a report, made to feel like an inconvenience or a second-class citizen. And with all the delays and costs associated with using 101 to report, it's unsurprising that, for example, 1/3 of all calls to the Met, for example, last year were abandoned. And of course, we know the cost of a call to 101 is 15p, and that may seem a very small charge to many of us in the room, but for some of the most vulnerable and some of those least able to pay, it can represent a huge barrier. It can represent the choice between putting money on the levy meter or indeed calling 101. No other national non-emergency service in the UK costs for people to call them. NHS 111, free. UK power cut service 105, free to use. How is it acceptable that victims of antisocial behaviour have to pay for their right to report an incident? So we're pleased to see, obviously today with this report, the call for the review of the 101 service featuring in the report, and it's something we'll be looking to build on as we craft our own narrative around how antisocial behaviour and violence fit together and how we build that new vision for our system. It should come as no surprise too that antisocial behaviour is a topic that the public have strong feelings about. More than 3 in 5 voters told us they would be more likely to vote for a party that gave victims of antisocial behaviour more rights to help ensure persistent problems get resolved by the authorities. And as we've heard, there's significant room for improvement in this arena, and we look forward to building on those recommendations set out today. The implications of not tackling are serious and grave, and many of us in this room know and recognise. Antisocial behaviour is also something that is interwoven with so much of what we do here at the CSJ, from addiction to unemployment to educational failure and family breakdown. They all contribute to and exacerbate the problem, but there are also consequences for too many of the victims. And in the most horrendous cases, as we know from perhaps the 2 most well-known of a decade ago, namely obviously the tragic murder of Gary Newlove, and also the deaths of Fiona Pilkington and her daughter Frankie, to name but 3 in total, antisocial behaviour can have the most devastating consequences, and that is why we look forward to sharing our own recommendations in due course, building on that, and we invite you all, if you have views, to feed in, to participate. And finally, just to say, it's been a pleasure to work with you guys on this topic, and yeah, I hope that we can continue to do so.
Thank you to everyone. We're going to open the floor for some questions and comments, etc. Please introduce yourself before you make said comment. Any questions?
Oh, we can go home.
Over there.
Yeah, I'm Ed Davis, so I'm here at the CSJ. A slightly almost feel quite downbeat on antisocial behaviour. I just wondered, particularly coming from your position, Baroness, at the time you said not much has changed. Has anything changed? Is there any ray of hope in this area? Is there anything we can build on that has worked so far?
I haven't really, I can't say there is, because when we are seeing inspections, I remember one area where they're saying they're kind of doing very well. I think it was, one police force I went to, and they were doing very well, yet the people that I was speaking to afterwards, which are victims, because that's mostly victims, and the harrowing effects of what they were going through on social behaviour, it didn't seem very well. So my worry is it seems to be a tick box situation, but the impact, and these were professional people, because I think another thing with antisocial behaviour, we kind of say, well, it's where the Bronx is, and even when they describe where I live, Leafy Padgate, I'm thinking, what's that got to do with it? It's about the human impact of that. But for me, the level of violence, drugs being smoking next door and coming through your vents, because now we're building more and more apartments. And there was a family there with a disabled child, and actually I think he was waiting for a lung operation, so he was constantly breathing in there. And for the authorities not to see that that's important and still class that as low level. I have to say, sadly, no, I'm not. If I did, I'd be sat here, I'm talking here, saying we've seen the light. There's no magic bullet, but I just don't think it's just authorities. I think it's society as a whole have become more aggressive, more rage, and I just think there's no respect for one another. If you can't ask a question, which sadly my husband did and lost his life, things haven't changed. I think we've gone even more aggressive. That's even more doom and gloom, sorry.
Penelope Gibbs from Transform Justice. I mean, it is quite downbeat, and it is definitely the case that victims are not getting resolution to their antisocial behaviour problems. I would just say, I think we've got a real problem with what happens when the police do act, because what happens is the perpetrators of antisocial behaviour go in front of a civil court and have a process which actually doesn't resolve their issues. So, they get an injunction, or they go to prison, or whatever, and these are frequently people with a multitude of problems. They're doing a lot of harm, but those problems need to be resolved. So, to call for the community to happen, for these people to go through the civil justice system is I'm afraid at the moment not the answer.
So any reflections on that? Do we have any stats on how many are repeat perpetrators of?
I think if only we did. I mean, I think your point is perfectly valid insofar as, obviously, as we recognise ourselves at CSJ, the perpetrators are often subject. They've got addiction issues, perhaps. They've got issues at school. They've got all sorts of issues. But I think to say that a community trigger or other measures aren't part of the solution, because I think they certainly are. And I suppose I would push back a bit and say that I think you're right to sort of question then, well, okay, so let's get that bit up front, the reception end right. And I think you're quite right to then say, well, how do we actually tackle the problems long term? And I think that's right, but I think we can't, it's not one or the other, I don't think.
But it doesn't help victims if the solution when it happens isn't a solution.
No, sure, but,
If you see what I mean.
it might at least provide some respite. I mean, from my experience, often
Possibly.
people just get shuffled around from house here to house there.
Yeah.
And I think, I mean, personally speaking, I would certainly say that too often it's victims who are the ones being caused to move. And that individual who then, the perpetrator say, who doesn't move, we still haven't dealt with their issues either.
Yeah.
So then some other, you know, unfortunate person or family move in next door. So I think you're right to highlight almost the sort of the need for that wider conversation. And for example, I mean, I think things like probation services, licence conditions, the broader question of the other sort of social services, that they're not involved in this. And I think when we've done our work, mental health and the sort of data sharing and partnership work with mental health is a real sort of sore point. You know, police don't want to overly criminalise people with mental health conditions for no good reason. But when the mental health teams aren't actually sort of playing ball, it becomes very difficult.
I think there's a case study actually in the report, which I find very depressing. Both that you quite rightly, it's a solution because it's the only solution for victims to go down. They have no rights, and you know, if your neighbour has got mental health issues and alcohol drug addiction or whatever, I appreciate that, but the housing association will hide under that banner instead of solving it, because whatever, if it's not that person, it's going to be somewhere else, and we don't seem to have that tangible solution. We seem to expect people to put up and shut up, but we're not tackling. So where's the accountability? And I think that's why there's got to be a legal requirement for that accountability to be shown. And the monitoring of this, there's never been any monitoring. I remember the law being passed, I was in the House of Lords, I was very frustrated. But you're not dealing with the both ends, you're dealing with one end. But it seems to be on the basis that the victim ends up moving instead of the authorities resolving the problem for everybody, really.
And I'll just say as well, one of the things with the community trigger is that it doesn't have to be the victim that activates it. So sometimes agencies are activating it to get mental health around the table or to get another agency to actually do something. So it can be a really positive experience to get everyone around the table to look at both victim and perpetrator and see what can be done.
Brilliant. There's a question at the back.
Sarah Murray from Buddy. I thought I'd just share with you a programme we have in Malaysia. So we provide technology to the Royal Malaysian Police. And if they have an offender who's committing these kind of crimes, they are tagged and they're moved to a completely different area of the country. So they might be moved 200 or 300 miles from where they live. And they're just integrated into a new community where they're split from their mates who they've been hanging around with. And we've been working for the last year or two with MOPAC to build a similar kind of thing. Obviously we can't move people here, we have the powers, but to prevent people hanging around together in gangs, so they're not allowed together in a public place, which would clearly have had an impact in your case. But my question is really around, if you look at the societies around the world where they're better at handling community crime, a lot of that is because the public don't expect the police to always be there for them and they have to raise their heads above the parapet themselves. How do we encourage individuals in society, how do we encourage citizens to take this on board themselves? And obviously, you know, I'd be scared to approach a gang, and from what I've heard today, I wouldn't dream of doing it. But there are apps like the Self-Evident app and Witness Evident that will enable people now to take that information, take that evidence and pass it to the police. And if those were brought together, you might be able to create some quite strong public data that could shame government and say, you know, here was a case where 30 people reported this and nothing was done. Whereas it's one victim here and one victim there, people tend to brush it under the carpet until it's something really, really serious. But if actually 30 people in the community have reported the same offence, perhaps it would be more seriously taken.
I think it's a really good question. And can I ask, in Malaysia, do they have the tagging voluntary? Or are they...
No, it's ordered by the courts.
Yeah,
They wouldn't volunteer.
Maybe that's a statement in itself, because I have worked, like I say, I've worked with Buddy because I think it's a fascinating system that they have. It's a quality system. But I think about empowering neighbourhoods. That's why we've got to have better working partnerships, the housing, the police, the counsellors. Only then will it empower victims to know they've got a place to come and give intelligence, because they are the eyes and ears for policing. And we've lost neighbourhood policing. But if we get all the agencies working in a hub, which I'm no good at geography, so apologies, where I've been around the country 43 lots of times, is that when it works, they see in the local communities that hub of all these agencies reporting on a daily basis, and that will empower all kind of age groups in our communities, because it's not just the elderly that are frightened. I've worked with some great young people who want to protect the elder in their communities. And in fact, I was a referee to one of them because, telling Ethel, you should go to bed at 8 o'clock, in the communities they've had 40 years. She thought that was terrible. But what they meant was actually they didn't feel safe, and we wanted them to do it. And it's breaking them boundaries as well. But empowerment is showing that we have the authorities there who believe in us. And once you get that strength, that empowerment will have a ripple effect where you live.
I think as well, in terms of, it is a great question. I think in terms of building that sort of community and that sort of voice, but also that sort of resilience actually to confront things. I mean, we did a report last year on obviously the serious violence that has been afflicted in so many places, and in there we specifically called for more, for example, uniformed youth organisations, which we know actually can make a real difference. You look at, for example, to the volunteer police cadets, very much similar sort of vein. But also things like, and some of us in the room have been to sort of these on-side youth zones, which can be a real hub. And it doesn't have to be a particular sort of type necessarily, but certainly when we go and visit places, we do see these, everything from those sort of classic kind of youth centres through to the much more shiny, brand new sort of on-side style, through to also community cafes. A colleague in the room, actually, Imogen, is working on this sort of paper of, what makes community and what role is there for community. So I think it's something we're alive to, but certainly something probably we don't have all the answers on.
There's too many elements to have one simple answer, and I think that shows where government has got to work more together. It drives me bonkers. We can have many great talking shops, but I'm sick of talking, I want to walk. And how much evidence do you need? It's about evidence to give you the next pound to fund. Well, actually, it's about lives. And it's about our society we live in and what we're sending out the message to the next generation. And to me, that's more important. Politics will come and go, but generations coming through will have a negative impact if we don't give them a future to have a healthier lifestyle.
Can I just reply on Rory's? Your comment about communities needing something like a community cafe, the kind of people we're talking about, deeply, deeply angry, they want to go to a community cafe. They want to go somewhere where they can smash something and be allowed to smash something. And you seem to, if you watch that on the movie, you would accept it as completely understandable. This is changing somebody, but we don't actually do anything about it in society. In New Zealand, they're just implementing a programme. The Minister of the Environment in 2018 committed to plant 1 billion trees in 10 years, and they were not on target to plant 1 billion trees. And the new Minister of Environment stood up and announced that they were going to plant 500 million trees and got a load of flack from the community. So what they decided to do is to require offenders to go out and plant trees in rural areas, and they'll be taken together and they'll work very hard all day. And you could say, well, okay, this is press ganging and all the rest, but actually they're doing something really positive for the community, which they might actually feel good about.
Yeah, precisely. I think the community cafe point, just to be clear in case I wasn't clear, is very much for the community who are, themselves need to sort of build a voice against those perpetrators. I think certainly there's a lot of scope for. Obviously, we've seen the state probation services at the moment. I think there's huge scope for reimagining how we do harness, that sort of capability.
Can I ask, is there any local areas, and notwithstanding the point that it's not got any better generally, but is there any local areas that are bucking the trend in this, i.e. lots of what's being said is about local interaction between agency, etc., as well as some of the national policy, but is there any, in your 43 visits, did you point to any particular area and say, this is a place that's really getting it right, and what are the net results of that?
Yeah, I am under PERDA, so I've got to be really careful. I know, don't worry, I could be here all day on this debate. But I think there was some slightly good ideas, and I think that goes down to the individuals, not what the legislation or policies. We've got some great workers out there, but they are frustrated themselves. They haven't got the funding, and again the funding formula, every 12 months, we're batting ping pong all the time. For sustainable programmes, you've got to put that in. So I think, sadly, no, I'm not jumping for joy. I think there's a lot of people who recognise it, and that's why it's great to work with these guys. But again, at the end of the day, to empower communities, we've got to have the right people and the right tools, and actually the right funding This is a 10-year programme. We seem to be talking about that for knife crime. Well, actually, shouldn't it be for every crime? You know, we shouldn't be having now to go through losing lives. So for me, I don't think it's one conversation to say, yes, this works well, because actually it comes down to the funding and who's the Police and Crime Commissioner funding that. So there's a lot of things that I would if I'd stand there and say this absolutely works. But I think we've come to a stage where we are at crisis point. As we're seeing on knife crime, we're seeing, and communities have nobody to go to, and it seems to be on the basis of the victim will just call us back and can't even call. So where do you go? And that's where the anger, the rage, and having no confidence in people, and that's changing. So I can't ignore, even with her, I can't even shine a light on that one. So, sorry to be dismal on that. But it's the workers that we need to shine a light on, not the actual area.
Right at the back there.
Hello, I'm Olivia. I'm a neighbourhood police officer at the minute on the Police Now scheme, so I'm looking at long-term problem solving. So yeah,
Front, not the back.
I'm doing everything, or trying to do everything that you're talking about. My thoughts are, when you've had conversations with victims of antisocial behaviour, and they've said that they've not been happy with what authorities have done, particularly for the police, how much of that do you think is because they don't feel the police have done enough? Or how much of that is because you think that the police have tried very hard but haven't come up with a solution? So, for example, like you say about people smoking particularly cannabis in apartment blocks, that's a massive issue in my area, and I'm at my wit's end with it. You know, I don't know how to solve this problem. I don't know how to deal with it. I've worked with the council. I've worked with the housing authorities there. I've been in and seen the people where we think the cannabis is coming from, but because it goes through vents, it goes through drafts, we don't know where it is, we don't know where to start with it. We haven't got the information to provide warrants to be able to deal with it in that way. You know, where do we then go? And then that's when the public feel like we're not doing anything. But in our eyes, we're doing everything we can. There's just not a problem. There's not a solution to this problem.
You sound ideal. Do you communicate all that information you've just said to the actual people?
Yes. So
right, well, can we clone you? Because the most important thing is actually police don't give any information. They listen to it and say either we haven't got the resources, can you call us back, and we'll get to you. And that is what I'm finding across the board. However, there is individuals like yourself who try to do the best, but you're blamed if you do and you're blamed if you don't. And that's important that you communicate, because what I am feeling, I'm hearing victims, they will not phone now, not because they don't believe, but actually, well, they're a bit over-resourced and we don't want to put on them. Now, where have we flipped to that? And that is appalling. So for me, that's about true neighbourhood policing. It's about communication. It's having the time to sit with people to understand what you guys need to go through. And that is not only just you, it's housing, local authorities, you know, the civil court. And if that can't be actioned, I think, you know, we have got to, you know, the elephant in the room is about sentencing. It's about respect, it's about accountability. And politicians will come and go. I don't want that. I want actually to say we did something. But I think we need to clone her, because communication is the biggest irritant for victims, whether it's this area we're talking about or any area. And that's the point. So they feel that, A, that was a waste of time, I've spoken to her, she's not giving me anything back. Or they phone up and they say, oh, they're on sick leave, they're on holiday. Nobody gets back and fills the gap. So that breeds no confidence and breeds that irritant again. And until it's a high crime, because you're focusing on a crime, which I can hear you go, which is fine, you're an investigator. But do we need to go to a high crime to say, well, we did act? Because, you know, that isn't what we want to do. We want to escalate it down, not up.
I also think it evidences that, like that example, really evidences how a community trigger or a case review, a multi-agency case review, with the right sort of problem-solving mentality to it, as opposed to that sort of classic defensive, right, how do we all cover ourselves, you know, from criticism. Actually, with that right approach, and again, it then comes to, it's not about marking their own homework, it's about having someone in there independent who can actually say, well, you know what, we've had the victims in, and actually if it affects a dozen people in flats, have them all there to help with that transparency and to help actually resolve the issue.
It's about feeling listened to and just communicating that. And I think there's lots of pockets of really, really excellent practice going on, but it's about having a platform to share that and for practitioners to say, you know, it might not work in their area, but to share that and say, we've done this here and evaluating it properly.
I think also there are going to be people who are dissatisfied because they wanted the next door neighbour evicted, but actually what we're trying to do is stop the antisocial behaviour. So, but what we're saying is that yes, there are those victims, but the issue here is that there are also people who are just not getting help, and they are being completely reasonable, and it's not right that they're putting up with that behaviour. And the community trigger is a way of saying, actually, has everyone done what they can? Yes, and communicate that to the victim. I know one council, they do, as soon as they get community trigger activation in, they pick up the phone and call the victim and have a chat with them. You wouldn't believe how many areas hold the victim at arm's length, and then they say yes, you know, they get a little email saying, we've received your activation, a case review will be held in 2 weeks, then the case review is held, then they get a letter saying, we had the case review and all procedures were followed. It's not what it's there for, and victims are left feeling even more fobbed off and ignored than ever before, really.
I think an important issue we all must recognise, if we own our own homes, this has a detriment on when you sell your home, because everybody's presuming we're in council housing association. My mum lives in a housing association house for 40 odd years and it's spotless. In fact, for people, I can't believe it's actually a council house. But the fact is, if you own your own home and you have to fill in all your forms to sell it and everything, you have to be open and honest. That has a huge impact. This was just in a recent case where actually they didn't declare it and now they have to pay compensation. So this isn't one size, it fits everybody, but it's not just one kind of housing we're looking at. This applies when you sell your home and has a huge impact. So it's for everybody's interest to look at where you live, and that's why social housing has a negative to it. But actually, if you buy your own home, selling it is a really issue for people to get out of there.
One final question.
Alex Royston from Prison Voicemail. My kind of thought on this is about what I'm wondering is how we tackle the scale of the problem. Just from my own experience, I've experienced multiple antisocial behaviour where I live right out in the sticks in Norfolk, and also even around our office. We know that drug dealers have bought the building next door. People with no money are driving 150 grand cars and things like this. And we've had a murder where we had a crime tape around our office not too long ago. The problem is that if we can't pull together all the information from collectively from all of us, the criminal justice system just can't cope with these, the sheer number of cases. If we could start to solve the problems, a lot of it is data sharing, particularly in the light of GDPR, where people can, people just, even I get this even in my day job dealing with the prison service, where someone will say, I'm telling them that I think this person might be a victim, and the person on the other end of the phone says, I'm not sure if I can share that data about the prisoner with you. So unless we can start to get some clarity around what data can be shared and use collectively all of us to collect information, we can't start to tease out the sort of the causation and who are those particular individuals that we can pick off first to attempt to address using the criminal justice system, who are the most antisocial. I had 3 thefts of oil in the last couple of years. There's one person who's making a fortune selling stolen oil around North Norfolk. That person is causing an immense amount of frustration, especially for elderly people who can't afford to top it up again. If we could all collect this crime data through whatever means, and we could once and for all remove the barrier that agencies can't share data, we could get politicians to clarify under what circumstances data can just be openly shared, and this is absolutely crystal clear, then we might be able to start addressing this. Because previously I lived in Singapore as well, and there was just no antisocial behaviour at all.
So maybe one last response to that, data sharing.
Data sharing was an issue when we had the riots. And it was supposed to be, we can share data information if it's stopping a criminal activity. However, my issue is people really understanding what data information they can share safely, and what that actually means in bold. So I think that is the crux to it, but I think it's also the training of understanding it. And I think that's where government has got to take a grip on this, and make sure you mean what you say on the tin. But data information, hopefully when we do the new Knife Crime Summit, this policy that we're going to do in 10 years' time, will have broken that. But I know I'll be a lot older, but I doubt that it ever will be.
I do think, actually, on a try and end on a more sort of positive note than anything else, really, I do think there is a real opportunity here for the centre, the Home Office in particular, to actually sort of step back into the ring a little bit here. You know, I think if you look back, obviously PCCs came in, there was a big push to sort of rid the system of bureaucracy, push everything out to the local. And I think the local took a while to catch up, perhaps in some cases maybe they never did. But I think the fact that, Jenny had to try and trawl through, hundreds of websites to try and find just community case stuff that should have been published. I think there's a huge sort of opportunity there for the Home Office, especially if, we're almost 5 years now on from that bill and act, the Antisocial Behaviour Act. There's an opportunity here to review that, and for the Home Office, I think, to sort of step back in, start collating stuff, start sharing stuff, and create that sort of opportunity for that very issue that you've just identified to actually be gotten a grip of.
Well, thank you. Thanks to everyone. We'll end there just because there is a slight bit of optimism, so we'll take hold of that. And with it. But thank you very much, Baroness Newlove. Thank you. Thank you for your leadership over the last number of years, and also we know that will continue. We feel very privileged. Thank you. Do help yourself to another coffee or a tea, and have a great day, everyone. Thank you.